Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. How are you, everyone? I hope you all have a wonderful day. Let's start our today's discussion. Today we are going to discuss about diplomacy, and in the previous video we discussed about the foreign policy, and we also talked about the tools that are used for the implementation of foreign policy, and one of that tool was diplomacy. So today we are going to discuss what is a diplomacy, what is its history, concept, importance, functions, and types of diplomacy. So let's move on. Well, I have listed the brief history of diplomacy in these 4 paragraphs. So it starts from Mesopotamia and Egypt's dynastic marriage to cement an alliance, trade diplomacy by merchant ambassadors. So that was the use of diplomacy in the historical perspective. Then the Greece use of rhetoric as a tool of public diplomacy. That was also a diplomacy, and I have listed all the historically importance of diplomacy, how the diplomacy have been the part of our society. Byzantium, because it had enemies all of its border and possessed only limited military might, so it used diplomacy as a tool for itself to survive for a long time, and they have been really successful in the history. And Italian diplomacy, Milan was the first to send representative to the court of France in 1455. So after the Italians, a proper method of diplomacy was devised, and a proper diplomacy came into limelight, I would say. That diplomacy spread in Europe with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So that was a complete formal attempt of diplomacy in 1648. And the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, treaty negotiated largely by Britain and France, with the other powers following their lead, ending the War of Austrian Succession in 1740 to 1748. So that was another example of diplomacy in the history. And even in the India, before independence, the government of British India maintained semi-autonomous diplomatic relations. It had colonies such as Aden settlement, sent and received full diplomatic missions, and was founder member of both League of Nations and United Nations. So from this slide you can understand that diplomacy have been the part of society from quite a long time, and it is still being used as an efficient tool for the solution of many problems in the international arena. So let's move on. Now let's talk about the definition of diplomacy. Diplomacy is broadly described as the art of conducting negotiations, agreements, and relations between two or more parties in a sensitive way. So from this definition you can understand that diplomacy can be used anywhere. It can be between the husband and wife, and it can be in between any two relations. But here in this presentation we are going to talk about the diplomacy in the international arena, in the international politics. In international relations, it forms the basis for peacemaking, economics, culture, trade, and wars, etc. That's the purpose of diplomacy in the international relations. So the definition of diplomacy in Oxford Dictionary is management of international relations by negotiations. That's the dictionary definition of diplomacy. Let's move on to the importance of diplomacy. Why we use diplomacy, what is its importance? In this slide we are going to discuss that. It helps in arbitration and mediations basically, and it is really important for that. If diplomacy wouldn't be available as a tool for the solution, then the ultimate result would be the full-fledged war, and that no country can afford that war nowadays. It can be really fatal for any country's or state's economy. It helps to implement foreign policy effectively. It is a tool of foreign policy, so it is used for the implementation of foreign policy that we discussed in the previous lecture. You can watch that video. Use of soft power methods to ensure international peace. So what happened in the history, that the only methods for achieving their national interest or achieving their goal was through war, but this is a soft method for ensuring international peace. Promotes cooperation between two states. That's what it does. When the two states are communicating with each other back and forth, so they are basically cooperating with each other. That's what this point is saying about dispute resolution that we talked about. Let's move on. So the functions of diplomacy are, what are its basic functions? It representing state interest. It represents states' national interest on the international arena, on the international political environment, obtaining information, gaining information about the other states, what they are doing and how they can arrange themselves in that political arena, promoting and protecting the interest of nations. That's what the function of diplomacy is. It promotes and protects. Diplomats are sent towards the other countries, and they protect the interests of their home nations, expand political, economical and cultural ties between two states. That's another function of diplomacy. It promotes all those aspects. So what are the types of diplomacy? Well, I have divided the different types of diplomacy in three broad categories that are based on economic power, political power, or cultural power. There are many types of diplomacy used in the international arena, but I have listed just a few of them that are mostly used in our today's international political system. So one of them is dollar diplomacy. So what is dollar diplomacy? It was basically a policy aimed at furthering the interest of the United States abroad by encouraging the investment of US capital in foreign countries. That was implemented in the President Taft, I would say. And then another economic based policy is stick and carrot diplomacy, most used diplomacy by the international powers to influence the powers that are on the lower rung of the international system. So it is based on four types of bargaining tactics. It is based on threats, punishments, rewards and promises. And the political based diplomacy are shuttle diplomacy, when a country is trying to create a solution between the two warring states, or trying to resolve the dispute between two states. That's a shuttle diplomacy. Partner diplomacy is related to the China basically, and its diplomacy is termed as partner diplomacy. Cultural diplomacy is exchange of culture through people to people contact. That's another type of diplomacy. Citizen diplomacy, that is what it is. And there are also three methods of diplomacy that are track one diplomacy, in which only the state officials are meeting and negotiating something or some issue. And in the track 2 diplomacy, when the state officials on the one side and the civil society or the civil people are meeting with them and resolving some issue and negotiating on some aspects, is called the track 2 diplomacy. And track 3 is when the people to people contact between two states people is happening. That's the track 3 diplomacy. So that was all about diplomacy. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.